Continuing along in chapter 6, this is part 4 of that chapter, and we are reading from The Rape of the Mind. The dictator is not only a sick man, he is also a cruel opportunist. He sees no value in any other person and feels no gratitude for any help he may have received. He is suspicious and dishonest and believes that his personal ends justify any means he may use to achieve them. Peculiarly enough, every tyrant still searches for some self-justification. Without such a soothing device for his own conscience, he cannot live. His attitude toward other people is manipulative. To him, they are merely tools for the advancement of his own interests. He rejects the conception of doubt, of internal contradictions, of man's inborn ambivalence. He denies the psychological fact that man grows to maturity through groping, through trial and error, through the interplay of contrasting feelings. Because he will not permit himself to grope, to learn through trial and error, the dictator can never become a mature person. But whether he acknowledges them or not, he has internal conflicts. He suffers somewhere from internal confusion. These inner weaknesses he tries to repress sternly. If they were to come to the surface, they might interfere with the achievement of his goals. Yet in the attacks of rage, his weakening strength is evident. It is because the dictator is afraid, albeit unconsciously, of his own internal contradictions, that he is afraid of the same internal contradictions of his fellow men. He must purge and purge, terrorize and terrorize in order to still his own raging inner drives. He must kill every doubter, destroy every person who makes a mistake, imprison everyone who cannot be proved to be utterly single-minded. In totalitaria, the latent aggression and savagery in man are cultivated by the dictator to such a degree that they can explode into the mass criminal actions shown by Hitler's persecution of minorities. Ultimately, the country shows a real pathology, an utter dominance of destructive and self-destructive tendencies. The final surrender of the robot man. What happens to the common man in such a culture? How can we describe the citizen of totalitaria? Perhaps the simplest answer to this question lies in the statement that he is reduced to the mechanical precision of an insect-like state. He cannot develop any warm friendships, loyalties, or allegiances because they must be too dangerous for him. Today's friend must be, after all, tomorrow's enemy, living in an atmosphere of constant suspicion not only of strangers but even of his own family. He is afraid to express himself lest concentration camp or prison swallow him up. The citizens of totalitaria do not really converse with one another. When they speak, they whisper, first looking furtively over their shoulders for the inevitable spy. Their inner silence is in sharp contrast to the official verbal bombardment. The citizens of totalitaria may make noise and utter polite banalities, or they may repeat slogans to one another, but they say nothing. Existing literature reveals that leading authors, among them H.G. Wells, Huxley, and Orwell, grow more and more concerned about the ghastly future of the roboticized man, training as a machine on a standard of conformity. They translate for us the common fear of a mechanized civilization. In totalitaria, the citizen no longer knows the real core of his mind. He no longer feels himself an I, an ego, a person. He is only the object of official barrage and mental coercion. Having no personality of his own, he has no individual conscience, no personal morality, no capacity to think clearly and honestly. He learns by rote. He learns thousands of indoctrinated facts and inhales dogma and slogans with every breath he draws. He becomes an obedient pedant. And pedantry makes people into something resembling pots filled with information instead of individuals with free growing personalities. Becoming wiser and freer implies selective forgetting and changes of mind. This we accept, this we leave behind. Alert adjustment requires a change of patterns, the capacity to be deconditioned, to undo and unlearn in order to become ripe for new patterns. The citizen of totalitaria has no choice for such learning through unlearning, for growth through individual experience. Official oversimplifications induce the captive audience into acceptance and indoctrination. Mass ecstasy and mass fanaticism are substituted for quiet individual thought and consideration. Hitler taught his people to march and to do battle, and at the end they did not know wherefore they marched and battled. People become herds, indoctrinated and obsessed herds. Intoxicated first with enthusiasm and happy expectations, then with terror and panic. The individual personality cannot grow in totalitaria. The huge mass of citizens is tamed into personal and political somnambulism. It may be scientifically questionable to compare experiences gained from individual pathological states with social phenomena and to analyze the partial collapse of the ego under totalitarianism by analogy with actual states of madness. But there is in fact much that is comparable between the strange reactions of the citizens of totalitaria and their structure as a whole on the one hand, and the reactions of the introverted schizophrenic on the other. Even though the problem of schizophrenic behavior in individuals and groups is extremely complicated and cannot be fully handled within the scope of this book, the comparison can be helpful in our search for an understanding of the nature and effects of totalitarianism. The common retreat from reality. This excursion into the world of pathology is not a description of a merely coincidental resemblance between a disease and a political system. It should serve to point up the fact that totalitarian withdrawal behind official justifications and individual fantasy is something that can occur either in social life or inside the individual mind. And many scholars believe in a relationship between cultural deterioration and schizophrenic withdrawal. Let us briefly explain the individual schizophrenic's reaction of complete inner automatization and mental withdrawal as a personal failure to adjust to a world experienced as insecure and dangerous. Often rather simple emotional incidents may lead to such schizophrenic retreat. For instance, the intrusion of schedules and habits forced in the mind during infancy, or a sly hypersensitivity to our overactive and over-verbose culture. Many a child is forced into schizophrenic withdrawal by an over-compulsive parent. Sometimes lack of external contact may drive a man into a state of utter loneliness and isolation. Sometimes his own preference for solitude. A certain tendency to so-called schizophrenic withdrawal has been proved to be inborn. Yet, it can be provoked in everybody. Whatever the cause, the schizophrenic patient becomes a desocialized being, lost in loneliness. Conscious and unconscious fantasy life begins to become dominant over alert confrontation of reality. In the end, his weird fantasies become more real for the schizophrenic than the actual world. He hides more and more behind his own iron curtain in the imaginary dreamland and retreat he has built for himself. This is his nirvana, in which all his dream wishes are fulfilled. Inertia and fanaticism alternate. The patient regresses to an infantile vegetative form of behavior and rejects everything that society has taught him. In his fantasy, he lives in a world which always obeys his commands. He is omnipotent. The world turns around according to his divine inclinations. Reality, requiring as it does continual and renewed adjustment and verification, becomes a persecutor, attacking his illusion of divine might. Every disturbing intrusion into his delusional world is encountered by the schizophrenic either with tremendous aggression or with the formation of secondary delusion to protect the first delusion, or with a combination of both. The schizophrenic displays tremendous hostility toward the real world and its representatives. Reality robs him both of his delusions of omnipotence and his hallucinatory sense of being utterly protected as he was in the womb. Clinical experience has shown that the disease of schizophrenia often begins with negativism, a defense against the influence of others, a continual fight against mental intrusion, against what is felt as the rape of the over-sensitive mind. Gradually, this defensive attitude toward the world becomes a hostile attitude toward everything, not only toward influence from the outside, but also toward thoughts and feelings from the inside. Finally, the victim becomes paralyzed by his own hostility and negativisms. He behaves literally as though he were dead. He sits unmoving for hours. He may have to be force-fed, force-dressed. The schizophrenic moves like a puppet on a string, only when someone compels him to. Clinically, we call this catatonia, the death attitude. And I will stop it right there. This was part 4 of chapter 6. We are in the rape of the mind. See you in the next video.